Welcome to this webinar on democracy in America. We've had nearly 100 people register, so thank you very much for joining us today in the afternoon in Ireland and in the morning in the US. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute at the National University of Ireland, Galway. David Kelly is helping us behind the scenes. He's the digital humanities manager in the Institute. Thank you again, David. And thank you too to Gwen O'Sullivan in the press office, who's been very helpful in supporting this event. We're delighted to have you here today. We welcome you, and please do participate via the Q&A function. We'll be keeping track of that. We have a distinguished panel today to discuss this question of democracy in America. Dan Balz is chief correspondent at the Washington Post. He joined the Post in 1978 and has been involved in political coverage as a reporter or editor throughout his career. He is the author of several books, including Storming the Gates, Protest Politics and the Republican Revival, published in 2006, and The Battle for America, 2008, The Story of an Extraordinary Election, 2009. He was born in Freeport, Illinois, and graduated from the University of Illinois and served in the US Army. He is a regular panelist on PBS's Washington Week and a frequent guest on the Sunday morning talk shows and other public affairs programs in the US. Stephanie McCurry is the R. Gordon Hoxie Professor of American History in honor of Dwight D. Eisenhower at Columbia University. She's an historian of the 19th century United States, the American Civil War and Reconstruction, and of the history of women and gender. She's the author of 3 books, Masters of Small Worlds, Yeoman Households, Gender Relations, and the Political Culture of the Antebellum South Carolina Low Country, 1995, Confederate Reckoning, Power and Politics in the Civil War South, 2010, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Women's War, Fighting and Surviving the American Civil War, published in 2019. She was born in Belfast and lives in New York City. Monica L. Miller is Professor of Africana Studies and English at Barnard College, Columbia University. She's the author of the award-winning book, Slaves to Fashion, Black Dandyism and Styling of Black Diasporic Identity. She's held grants from the Mellon Foundation, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. She's currently working on a book on Blackness, Swedish Style, Race, Diaspora, and Belonging, looking at emerging Black community in Sweden and its connection to Black European identity formation. She also serves as the Dean for Faculty Diversity and Development at Barnard College. We have 2 respondents today, I'm delighted to say. Eileen Gillooly directs the Center, the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center for Humanities at Columbia University. She's on the faculty in English and Comparative Literature, and also involved in the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society and the Institute for Gender and Sexuality Studies. Eileen is the author-editor of 5 books, including the award-winning Smile of Discontent, Humor, Gender, and 19th Century British Fiction. And she is currently a principal investigator on the Mellon Foundation-funded Justice in Education Initiative, which aims to increase tertiary educational opportunities for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals. And Lee Morrissey is Alumni Distinguished Professor of English at Clemson University and the founding director of the Clemson Humanities Hub. His books include The Constitution of Literature, Literacy, Democracy, and Early English Literary Criticism. In addition to serving as chair of his department and interim associate dean of his college, he has also been a Fulbright scholar at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and a McCarthy Fellow at Marsh's Library in Dublin. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Delighted to have you here to discuss this topic. There's so much that we can consider. I want to start with Dan Balz, if I could. Dan, you've been at the center of things for a long time now in covering politics in the US. My first question is an obvious one, and it's just to ask you about the decision of the House managers not to call witnesses. That was one of those curiosities of Saturday where it's like, oh, we're in for something could go on for weeks, and then suddenly it was off the table. What's your take on what happened there?
Well, I think what happened was that they saw an opportunity to put even more pressure on the Republicans in the Senate by bringing in the testimony from a Republican congresswoman, who had indicated, who had talked about a conversation that Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, had with President Trump on the day of the insurrection. And it was quite damning testimony because it gave a sense of the mindset of the president as McCarthy was pleading with the president to provide reinforcements really to help get the mob out of the Capitol and to bring on more troops, more National Guard. And the president's response was, well, Kevin, you must care less, or these people must care more about the election than you do. And that broke on Friday night. CNN's Jamie Gangel did the reporting on it. Although ironically, the Congresswoman Jamie Herona Butler had talked about this at her local paper some time ago, and nobody ever picked it up. It's one of those ironies of, we live in such a bubble here in Washington. Nonetheless, the House managers saw this as an opportunity. But the minute they got the approval to have witnesses, then there was a sense of chaos on the Senate floor, because nobody knew at that point exactly what this would mean. The managers had talked about one witness. The Trump legal team immediately said, well, we have a list of 300 witnesses that we want to call. Now, that would never have happened, obviously, but it pointed out the fact that this could turn into, if not an endless round of witness testimony, a prolonged time, at a moment when, it was clear what the outcome was going to be, because Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, had already indicated to people that he was going to vote to acquit and not vote to convict, which meant that there were a lot of Republicans, some Republicans, who might have gone with him if he had voted to convict. So everything was clear. And the second piece of this is that President Biden has an agenda that he's working very hard to try to get through the Congress at this point. He's got a very big COVID-19 recovery package, and there are a slew of nominations that are backed up in the pipeline that he needs to get through the Senate so that he can get his government formed. So there was this tension between the needs of the Democratic president and the aspirations of the House managers. And in the end, they worked out a fairly simple compromise, which was that they entered into the record the testimony or the statements from the Congresswoman and left it at that. And oddly enough, the Trump legal team at first stipulated to the accuracy of it and then tried to take it back toward the end of the day. I mean, it was we don't need to go into the Trump legal team in any great detail, but it was a mess from start to finish, frankly. And that was one more example of it. So I think that's what happened. But it was a couple of hours of chaos and uncertainty as to what was really going to play out.
Yeah, at one point I thought, as I say, it was going to go on for weeks, and then suddenly it was over. And okay, I guess, as we were almost. I suppose the looming question at the moment is really what becomes of the Republican Party. Is it the party of Trump, as it's often been declared, as a kind of wholly owned subsidiary? That phrase is sometimes used. There was a hostile takeover by Trump that's been successful. I mean, is that what you anticipate at the moment, that really Trump is going to be controlling the destiny of the Republican Party one way or the other for the next, say, 4 years?
Well, I don't know for the next 4 years. I think for the foreseeable future, he has a grip on the grassroots of the Republican Party. What we have seen is that anybody who strays from Trump orthodoxy, particularly in this period since the insurrection, whether it was Liz Cheney, who's the number 3 leader in the House, to any of the people who voted to convict him, that state Republican parties and local Republican parties have been very quick to condemn them or to try to censure them. Those don't have any practical, effect, but they are a reminder that people at the grassroots are still adherents of President Trump. He obviously got 74 million votes. President Biden got 81 million, but 74 million is a lot. Not all 74 million are pure loyalists of Trump, but a good share are. And I think we will have to see how he decides to wield the influence that he continues to have. But what we've seen in the time, really since I would say mid-December and more recently, is a growing effort on the part of what I would still call establishment Republicans to try to take the party back, to try to take the party away from Trump, or at least to diminish them. And I think that the clearest example of that was Mitch McConnell. The speech he gave after the vote, after he had voted to acquit, the speech he gave could have been given by any of the House managers in his condemnation of the conduct of the president. And George Will had a very interesting column in our paper a day or two ago talking about kind of McConnell's, he noted that McConnell's memoir, autobiography, was called The Long Game. And his analysis, and I think this is a smart analysis, is that McConnell recognizes that had he voted to convict, he would have stripped himself with, in a sense, the authority to still speak as a Republican leader. But by having done what he did, he can now make the case, as he started to do the other day, that Donald Trump is toxic to the future of the Republican Party. And that's the tension that's the tension that exists. It's the tension that's going to play out. But I say a lot still depends on how the former president decides to try to wield the influence that he still has.
Yeah. Well, actually, I guess it kind of takes us in a slightly different direction. I'm struck by the degree to which the current moment is an extension of a two-party system and of almost of a logic working its way out to a certain extent of the fact that there are really two forces locked in a kind of zero-sum competition. And one of the threats presumably posed by Trump is of a third party emergence, if he, depending on what kind of traction he has within the Republican Party. I mean, do you see this as a two-party scenario, or is it just something distinctive about this moment and the forces within, particularly within the Republican Party just now?
Well, there's been a lot of talk and analysis about whether the Republican Party will break into two pieces. Because the never Trump wing of the party is so disenfranchised and disenchanted with the state of the Republican Party as it now exists. But I think that given the history of this country, the prospect of third parties or of a new party forming has to be daunting to anybody who tries to start it out. There really has been no successful new party started since the Republican Party was formed back in the 19th century. There have obviously been third-party candidates who have run, whether it was Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 or Ross Perot in 1992 and 1996. But in no case has any of those created enough critical mass to form a party of any lasting strength. And so I think at this point, there is a battle within the Republican Party for what that future is going to be. And there's a lot of analysis that I think is quite sound that in many ways the Republican Party, even a party not quite of Trump, is on the wrong side of history because of the demographics of this country and the changes that are underway. But be that as it may, I think that the Republican Party is going to fight this out internally, and then if that doesn't work, then maybe we would be talking more seriously about a third party. But at this point, I think we're still in a two-party environment in the U.S.
Yeah, that seems to be very much the case. I mean, it is distinctive, and I'm struck by, in the European context, by how political parties emerge. And these are the old, this is the old world, but it seems to be more, with Macron and in Italy and other examples are really quite striking about how parties emerge. Obviously, different systems, typically in parliamentary democracies, but that doesn't seem to be a possibility in the U.S. And third-party candidates have really been more spoilers, and they can be significant, but not really in any prospects of electoral returns per se.
Oddly, Dan, we have sort of in essence a parliamentary government without a parliamentary system. But by that I mean the two sides are now so far apart, and whenever there is a party change in power, the new party wants to try to institute the agenda that it has, but because of the way our system works, and particularly because of the filibuster rules in the Senate, it's impossible to get anything through, or very difficult to get anything through without 60 votes. And so that tends to cripple any efforts on the part of a new administration, say the Biden administration, to be able to work its will on the agenda that it ran on and won on in the election. So that's part of the reason we have this kind of gridlock and stasis in Washington. There are some narrow ways around it, and the Biden administration is likely to use one of those in order to get the COVID package through. But overall, it's very difficult to legislate in the system that we have now, even though the parties have agendas that are just so far apart from one another that there's very little room in the middle to do anything in terms of compromising.
Yeah, I think that's such a striking feature of the U.S. system, of the lack of alignment between the executive and the party in Congress in this case. which, again, there are different ways of making it work. Reagan had his own kind of formulas when he was dealing with Tip O'Neill, but we seem to have arrived at a moment where it's like, no, you kind of essentially block whatever initiatives the other party is taking. And if you have the numbers, you're successful. If you don't have the numbers, you live with the consequences. So,
well, one of the advantages that Reagan had is that the parties hadn't sorted themselves out ideologically in the way they have now. I mean, Reagan was successful because there were a lot of conservative and moderate Democrats who ended up supporting many of the things that he wanted legislatively, particularly the domestic agenda of taxes and spending cuts. And with the '94 election and the Republican takeover, that's when the sorting out of the parties really took hold. And so you now have two parties that are quite ideologically consistent internally. But again, there's no bridge across that for anybody to do it. Somebody said to me recently, anytime someone tries to build a bridge, somebody else blows it up.
Yeah, that's well put. It's interesting you trace that to '94. Yeah, I kind of think of George Bush as consolidating a different kind of moment in which the logic of US politics was about consolidating your base and not really appealing, because Bush was thought to be somebody who would have to, because of the circumstances of his election, have to reach out and to govern, in a more centrist way. And he clearly showed no appetite for that, put it that way. So
he did only one thing, which is early on, he reached out to Teddy Kennedy and they worked on an education bill together.
Okay.
But that was about the last time.
Right. The last hurrah.
Right.
Yeah. Stephanie, I wonder if I could turn to you and get your take on this. I'm interested in your perspective historically, and there's so many aspects of that one could talk about. One, I guess, that is an obvious one, is the Electoral College, and you've probably been asked a zillion times about it. But I'm just kind of struck by the fact that all of the Trump premise of denying the electoral outcome was really pegged to the legitimacy of the Electoral College. In other words, if I can discredit the votes in this, that, and the t'other state, yeah, job done if I get my 12,000 votes in Georgia. But it absolutely ignores the plurality, which spoke pretty emphatically this time. So I just wonder about the role of the kind of undemocratic democracy that seems to have evolved in the U.S.
Yeah, well, I think it's a kind of treacherous time to be a historian, because there's so many resonances, even with the 19th century past. And they're enlightening, but they're kind of misleading too, I think. I mean, in the way you put it, the undemocratic state of democracy. Okay, so before the election, I openly worried, as somebody who knows about the 1870s in the United States, about a very close election descending into violence, as it did in many state houses, and over contested elections in the southern states in the late 1860s and 1870s, after Black men got the right to vote. But I mean, even I couldn't have imagined that what was really in the past were regional conflicts became a national, like state elections and state election houses, and the state reporting of the vote. Well, we had that too, right? We had that fight in Georgia and everywhere and many other places. But these bloody white supremacist attacks on Black people's right to vote, overturning elections by fraud and by force, this is a long tradition in US history. So historians have a lot of perspective on that. But what was shocking to me, even knowing all that, was watching it play out in the Capitol and in an invasion of the Capitol, a storming of the national Capitol. And I think that, and the attempt to overturn a national election at the national level, the certification of the Electoral College vote in Congress, this was unprecedented and truly, truly shocking, even to people like me who know quite a bit about all the shit that went on in the past. And I think really, in many ways, and many people have said this, that white Americans are learning what Black Americans have always known, that fact and right or justice, there's no protection. I mean, so you can have a majority and you can still lose. That's no surprise to a lot of people in US politics. It's just a lot of surprise. It's a surprise to entitled white people. So, we kind of squeaked our way through this, but we're not in great shape. That was not a peaceful transfer of power. And, I feel like as a historian, looking backwards and looking forwards, the past is very helpful, but it's also, I think, an impediment to thinking about the current moment. We're kind of, I feel like a person who's sort of standing, stunned, surveying the wreckage, and my tools as a historian and the way, in fact, some historians are engaging in the dialogue right now is both helpful and unhelpful, because I think this is a new political moment. We need new political solutions, and the constant reiteration of we need a third Reconstruction, for example, I really don't feel that way. I really don't think that is what we need. We need to engage with, we need to engage with the situation we're in now. And I think it's a new political moment, and it will require, I just think we're in for a long, dirty struggle, honestly.
Yeah. I guess one of the questions that I've been wondering about is also the kind of tools for what you might call dispute resolution in politics seem to have changed. And I was struck by, having grown up in the US, and the references to the Civil War have taken on a different kind of connotation. And it's almost as if the Civil War is now our normative expectation for how disputes are resolved. That's an alarming moment. I mean, did you pick up on that language yourself? Do you attach significance to it?
No, it's really true. I mean, a few days after the election, I was asked to go on a news show and discuss about whether we're in a new civil war. And the first time the journalist said that to me, I thought, well, no, I mean, that's hyperbolic. Like, no, we're not in a new civil war. But I mean, it's not only that they made a decent case about this, but, I think the level of partisan digging in is, I guess what is different is that I think the Civil War we had in 1861 to 65 was over some fundamental, a really fundamental issue that everyone understood, which was the legitimacy of slavery as a system of labor exploitation and assault on human dignity and human rights. And the country divided fundamentally over that. If you're going to have a war, that's something to have a war over. I don't think there's as much coherence now over what the divisive issue is, except the loss of a system of privilege that was retained and kept alive even after the dismantling of slavery as the foundation of the US social and political system. And, in many ways, so you could sort of see all of this as a long aftermath, but I think that's a little bit played out too. And what is it now? Like, what is the nature of the ideological division now? And anyway, we always have to remember, like, the people who are really dug in on the right, the sort of the partisan right, the populist sort of white supremacist right, it's powerful, but it's a minority. And, in that sense, I think American politics is coming to seem more like what you all are used to in Europe, at least in continental Europe, with a strong socialist left, which we don't really have, and a growing populist right, which is organized around various issues of racial exclusion of various sorts, but also of an assaulted masculinity, of male privilege, and a lot of hostility to women and women's rights and feminist claims. And we have all of that too. So I think it's more, I mean, I could be wrong about this. I'm curious what other people think. But one thing that I have thought since this election is, the US has lost any claim to exceptionalism. It's certainly, I never bought it as a historian, but even listening to Jamie Raskin sum up in the House manager's case, my heart was just sinking. I don't know how anybody can stand up and spout these, let's live up to our ideals. I mean, more power to him for believing it, but historians like Jill Lepore have been recently writing these books, these truths, let's live up to our ideals. Look, this is really played out. I mean, we've had 200 years of failing to live up to those ideals. And I think we need to grapple with why and what that is and the politics of the moment. And to me, it seems like we're more, I mean, maybe we have a different political system, the two-party system, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have these splits that you all have to live with and coalition governments. But in terms of the electorate, I feel like we're on that sort of center left right split that is, I think the recent elections in Spain and Catalonia, the socialists gained and Vox gained.
Yeah.
I feel like that's where we are too. I could be wrong, but it feels more like everything else now to me.
Yeah, no, I think that's I think it's a very interesting observation. And I must say it kind of rings true to me. There are respects in which, and precisely where that comes from with Trump, his instincts, I don't know, but it looks more familiar with his personality is more kind of Eastern European strongman of nominal democracies, and where you expect the family to be enriched in the process of holding office. And, I don't know if that has something to do with Melania Trump's recognition of of Donald as a leader, but I'll leave that aside. Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the impeachment process too. Again, reflecting on a parliamentary system where you could have a vote of no confidence, and in some ways, yeah, I mean, maybe in a different political system, that might have been the alternative. Like, okay, we've reached the limit with Trump. We can't support this person, and then it's quick and and over in that sense. This is such a protracted semi-judicial process that isn't really judicial, and where they're jurors, but they're not really jurors. I mean, you just seem to end up with this kind of mess that looked like the wisdom of the framers and actually is more like a scenario of a farce.
100%. I mean, these Trump lawyers couldn't figure out what was going on, right? This guy kept thinking it was like a personal injury trial or a criminal trial, and people were laughing, and it's just crazy. But this is another case, I think, where we're in new territory. This was the fourth impeachment and non-conviction in American history. 2 of them of Donald Trump, 3 of them in the last, 30 years. So what is left? Like, what guardrails are left? So if you think about the last 5 years, the norms and customs of the constitutional order proved no safeguard. So now Democrats are trying to write all these things in. Do presidential candidates have to show their taxes and their financial commitments and interests, their media investments, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that didn't work. Congressional oversight didn't work. There are subpoenas still sitting out there. So we have a big empowered executive in the United States and a congressional oversight arm that has been shrunk to nothing under Trump. And now we have impeachment, the court of last resort. And I think that amendment is a dead letter. They might as well take it out of the Constitution because it cannot work. I mean, when Trump was first impeached, I was of the conviction, very prosaically, that it was important to impeach him even though conviction was extremely unlikely. Yeah. I don't think that anymore. I actually just think impeachment is now pointless. It doesn't, I mean, in a court of public opinion, okay, the House managers did an amazing job. But basically the impeachment, the ability to impeach is a dead letter, and that part of the Constitution is a dead letter. So if that's true, then what is the safeguard? What is the ultimate safeguard against a truly corrupt president who would make war against his own even his own party and his own country, against his own oath of office to stay in office? So we have to face up to the fact that we actually don't have any ultimate break on that. And that's what I mean about new territory. So I don't think we're going to be hearing a lot more about impeachment in the near future. I don't think you're going to have to brush up anymore, as we did in the last 18 months, on what the rules of impeachment are and what happened when Andrew Johnson was impeached. Doesn't matter. I mean, it was the most bipartisan impeachment vote. So I guess that's something, but I think that tells you a lot.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I mean, there is a serious problem there, because if you have really no recourse in that sense, and it can never be in a party's interest to have that failure on its own record. So that's going to limit the possibilities. And we've certainly seen people willing to defend the indefensible.
I mean, the election vote itself proved to be the only safeguard, and it had to be protected at every level of the system. And I think we're very, very lucky that it held, to be honest.
No, and I think a lot of scenarios that where it might have worked out differently. If, for example, it had come down to one state or one, Miami-Dade County or whatever, Broward, et cetera, we could have been in a very different situation if Trump could have galvanized all of his forces to focus on one area alone. Might have been very different. Monica, I wonder if I could turn to you now and get your take on this. You're professor of Africana studies, so there are obviously questions of race have figured extremely powerfully during the Trump presidency and of galvanizing his own electorate. But there were these really powerful interventions and organizations of Black voters, obviously in Georgia in particular. So, yeah, how do you respond to this, where the U.S. is at the moment?
I think I respond in a bunch of mixed ways, which I think is really, where we are. I mean, last night I was really, in preparation for this, I was thinking, we're in such a tension, like some of the ways that, Stephanie was talking about, the way that we're in new territory. I mean, and, the way that the past is not helping us kind of work through the present. I mean, I feel that's both true and untrue, right? I mean, I think I'm thinking a lot about, in terms of organizing, what you're mentioning about, sort of Stacey Abrams and other folks in Georgia. I mean, I think, there's a way in which some of the things that we've witnessed are really, based in past social movements, right? That have really, had profound effects on the US, on democracy, on kind of, Black people's feeling of possibility within the institutions, right? At the same time, right, when we think about all of the, and I think of, Jamie Raskin's, ability to, or the way that he hailed and kept repeating, right, the way that Trump is so aligned with these kind of white supremacist militia groups, right? I mean, we've both like kind of seen, a tremendous amount of social progress and actually kind of, really, really important grassroots organizing of Black people, right, at the same time, right, and this is common, right, at the same time that it's being met with a lot of, with a tremendous amount of violence. So I was thinking, it's such an interesting moment to think about, right, Kamala Harris in the White House, being the second to Joe Biden at the same time, right, that so many, I think, and in particular after this weekend, I mean, although not in particular after this weekend, but, at the same time as so many people have lost trust, right, in institutions and in the ways in which those institutions are functioning at the moment, both I think politically, but also if, like, we think about the way that the pandemic is behind all of this, right, the way in which it's not just about politics, right, it's also about life, right? So I feel like there's this incredible tension that I think has been there for a while, right? But it's really, really stark at the moment, right? In terms of how people, right, are thinking about their relationship to government and institutions.
Yeah, and for Biden in particular, I mean, how do you think he's going to need to deliver? Because and his inaugural address, I thought, was quite striking and more overt in its acknowledgments. But it's one thing to acknowledge the transformative effect of support of Black voters. But what do you think he's really going to have to deliver on to, find whether he's the candidate the next time or his party is trying to put itself forward as the party that did something.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's again a kind of combination of things. I mean, I think it's one of the things that we've been talking about I've been to since the beginning of the year. I've been to a couple of seminars where Black cultural critics who are not either historians or political thinkers in the political science necessary way have been talking about precisely this issue, maybe not on those exact terms, right? But what are we, what are people looking for? And I'm not speaking for everyone, right? And so there has been a kind of, I mean, there's a longstanding disagreement, within or a series of disagreements within Black studies that are about, I mean, a kind of Black radical tradition, right, versus a kind of Black liberalism, right? So, I mean, so again, like I think we're seeing that play out a little bit, right, in terms of, how people have considered the Kamala Harris vice presidency, right, and the way in which we're hoping, right, I mean, our people are hoping, right, that she's not just the vice president, right, in name, right, but that she will actually have an ability to affect policy going forward. So there's that crowd. And then the other crowd is sort of like, well, these institutions have been failing Black people for forever, right? So, I mean, so should we not, right, actually think about other modes of engagement, right, that are much more about sort of, at least in terms of, social net, much more in terms of sort of mutual aid and those kinds of things. Like, it's the grassroots versus the kind of institution, right? So in terms of what Biden will have to do, I think he's going to have to do both and, right? I mean, there's going to have to be a way in which, for example, the pandemic relief that's coming down the road, that will have to be real, right? I think, it will have to be real and effective and, visible and obvious, right? And at the same time, though, that I think, part of making that real, honestly, does enable, right, a kind of, the folks who rely on a government-led social safety net, right, to actually do the other work, right, of sort of pushing the institutions, from below. Right. So I feel like, those things have to happen together. Right. And in some ways they are, honestly, mutually constitutive in a way. Right. So that, it will have both of those things, I think, will have to happen together.
Yeah. Something I can't resist asking you about because of your work is partly on the Trump rapprochement, if I can call it that, with the rap world and his pardoning of rappers and so on. Yeah, that's an interesting thing in its own right, and his relationship, we can call that, with Kanye and so on, as part of this, I guess, the theater and bizarreness of the Trump presidency. But I guess, there's a more serious question lurking in one way, which is, Trump had his own rather novel approach. I've been the best president that, Black Americans have ever had. And I don't really know quite what the actual figures are on the outcome. They seem to have been based on exit polls and other things, suggesting a little bit of a movement in the Trump direction. I just wondered what's your kind of take on that, either the rap side of the equation or the recruitment of, potentially for the future by Republicans, of some Black voters.
That is such an interesting question, Dan, and something I've been puzzling for a long time, and I've written a little bit about Kanye in particular when he was running for president, right? And I think one of the things that Stephanie mentioned that I think was really important, right, is to think a lot about the relationship of Trump and his base to forms of toxic masculinity, right? And I think some of the ways in which Black cultural critics have thought about Kanye, but also more particularly Lil Wayne, who was his most recent convert, right? Has to do with that, right? It has to do with a kind of alliance. An alliance around that, right? Rather than anything that has to do, right? Has much more to do with, maybe, this is speculation, has much more to do with gender than it has to do with race, right? And not that those things can be separated, but, if we think about it prismatically, right? We're looking at something that, we can turn and see from a different angle. Those gestures are, they're gestures. Right. So in terms of, I'd be curious to see the numbers too. I find it, I find that appeal, right? An appeal, right, of a Trump kind of bravado, toxic masculinity to be impossible. To be a little bit difficult to understand. But if one can understand it, I think it would have to be along those terms. And it would have to do with, right, at least if we think about it in a purely racialized and Black context, it would have to do with, and now I'm going to get psychological, but it would have to do with a certain kind of feeling of real kind of dispossession, right? A kind of reaction to dispossession, whether that happens or whether we're looking at it, sort of in a white context or, right, in some ways, in a more racialized context, in terms of like what access does one have to power, right? And to power, and how do we define that power, and what access do we have to that power on whose terms? I think that's how I would put it.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think that's an extremely interesting term to use. And it kind of comes back to Stephanie's point about, that white Americans are experiencing something which other members of the country maybe know rather better.
Yeah.
And the disorienting effects of losing grip on power and the responses to that, I think, are interesting. I also happen to agree with you that the masculinity element must be a strong point of contact, let us say, between the rapper folks who were enthused by Trump and his enthusing about them, I guess. Yeah, maybe it could kind of get people to turn their cameras back on, and we'll resume a kind of general discussion for the next little while. We have some questions coming in, things I'd like to ask you about. So Dan, I might begin with you, because there was a question that came in about what somebody refers to as the news landscape. So, that's got to go to you inevitably. And of course, the question is, one of the great ones of the moment about the, I guess what you might call the polarization of the US press. But also another question related I'd like to ask you about is really essentially about press freedom and the recovery from the Trump attack, and whether there is the basis for recovery. So just maybe about the news ecology at the moment and outlets that are strongly aligned with a particular position, as opposed to the ostensible impartiality of the press as a longstanding convention.
I don't know that there's any quick way out of where we are. I mean, I think that I've always thought that the press is a reflection of society, and people ascribe to the press, in my estimation, greater power than we all think we have, certainly, as whether it's individual journalists or institutions like the Washington Post or the New York Times or the cable networks or whatever. But this is not an original thought, but it is the problem that we have right now, which is that there is a part of the society, part of the population, that is unwilling to accept certain facts as facts. And there are networks, Fox being the most prominent, obviously, but there's others who prey on that and have preyed on that, and have allowed disinformation and misinformation and lies to find some fertile ground, so that you can't have a discussion about almost anything at this point, in which there is an agreement on the kind of factual grounding from which to begin that discussion. And so I think that's the media environment we're in. Obviously, it's a much more polarized environment. I mean, compared to the kind of environment that I started in many years ago, in which you had the 3 broadcast networks and the handful of major newspapers who were in one way or another gatekeepers. That's long gone, and probably in many ways for the better, but obviously we know that in some ways it's for the worse. I think all societies need some kinds of, I don't know if you want to call them referees, who can arbitrate in moments of disagreement, and at least provide context and historical background and an adherence to the facts. And we've lost that ability. And Trump made that so much more worse with his attacks on legitimate journalism. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to defend everything that everybody in what I would call legitimate journalism has done in response to that. But I think that for the most part, journalists in these organizations have always taken it as their responsibility to seek the truth and to tell the truth and to try to find the truth, even under attack from the President of the United States. But there's no question that he has dramatically weakened those institutions. And I don't know whether a Biden presidency can begin to repair that. Again, I mean, I go back to what others have said. This is a long struggle. I mean, we didn't get to this moment overnight, and we didn't get to this moment just because of Donald Trump. And getting out of it is going to take a long time. And I think that's the case for the press as well. I mean, there's such a sizable percentage of the population that that just simply will not believe anything that we at the Washington Post publish, whether it's a poll or an analysis or even a deeply reported article based on sometimes anonymous sources. And that's the state that we're in. And so I think that, speaking again from my perspective, we're just going to try to do what we've done and hope and believe that over time, what we have published withstands the test of time, proves to be the accurate record of the moment and of a period in history. But that's not great satisfaction for trying to resolve these problems right now.
Yeah, that is a huge challenge going forward. And I think it's in some ways, I think we live in an age of opinion in the sense that but even the way that news websites are presented, opinion is so much alongside and integrated in effect into the whole setup. It's not in the middle of the paper that you turn to after having read your news stories. It's a different reading relationship that I think has come into play. And it's also affected by the networks, which do much less reporting and much more essentially opinion offering. I'm thinking of CNN as well as Fox. It's really striking watching the CNN coverage. And it was commented on by Marina Hyde, the Guardian columnist, I think quite effectively, that the CNN coverage was already immediately covered in commentary. It's like there's actually a news story happening right now. Try to report on it. Don't embed it in commentary the moment it starts occurring. And I think there's been a move in that direction, and for multiple reasons, in multiple ways.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there is a corrosive effect of that, and I think it's this kind of overreaction, if you will, to what Trump has done. A feeling that we used to be very gentle about calling people out for a distorted statement. And everybody's become much more aggressive, and I think that there's some reason for that. I mean, that in order to push back, you have to talk louder. But I agree with that analysis that that sometimes the opinion and commentary overwhelms the telling of the story. And I mean, journalism is at its heart the telling of a story, and then people can begin to comment on it and form their own opinions on it. But I think on our site and many others, the opinion pieces are the most widely read, or often the most widely read, as opposed to some of the news stuff.
Oh, I think that's very striking. Stephanie, I wondered if I could ask you about a kind of related question of the role of Twitter and Facebook. I mean, I'm trying to imagine the counterfactual of Trump still being on Twitter in particular. It has changed the environment. It's not merely him leaving office, but the fact that he doesn't have access to this mode of communication. So that's something which is new about this moment. But it's also troubling because, I mean, maybe I'm putting this in an exaggerated way, but I sort of feel like, the future of the democracy is dependent on the policies of private companies that are actually determining, what happens. Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that vexed question of the social media dimension and access to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the decision to deplatform him immediately had meaning and effect for everybody in their ordinary lives, even if you're not on Twitter. It's that he no longer had that ability to instantly penetrate every news cycle and every individual's day, in this sense of what calamity are we in the midst of right now. And I have to say, just as a person living through this, I feel psychologically relieved not to be bombarded by Donald Trump on a daily basis or an hourly basis. But it begs the question and the recognition of why they wouldn't do that until so late in the game. And I really don't understand the rules of these private corporate. I mean, I've been trying to keep up and understand how they make these decisions about who gets to have the platform and who doesn't. But just as a simple observation, it's very power carries power. So they didn't deplatform him when he was president. He had to lose. Then he had to drag the country into an insurrection before he was deplatformed. So I think that's really a problem. And he's not the only one. I mean, all his seconds are still up there on Twitter doing his bidding. So I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, getting him off of there, I think has been good for everybody's mental health. And I think, and Dan was referring, I think, a bit to this, is it's taken the temperature down somewhat. And I think we're now in this, sigh of relief and trying to figure out, well, what difference is this going to make, right? Is he going to find another way to stir things up, or is it really just going to be quieter? And he's, people's lives are ruined and he's out there playing golf, but we don't have to care on a day-to-day basis. You can tell from the newspaper, the nightly news, it's different. But yeah, I mean, one of the differences between you guys and us is that even in Europe, they find ways to hold these private companies more accountable than in the United States. We're really enthralled to them, and that's frightening. I mean, I find that completely frightening. I mean, we haven't talked about the pandemic very much. Monica raised it, and I know we'll talk more, but just the lack of, just the way the United States works as basically a landscape of private corporations running our lives, including healthcare, is terrifying. And so we're in another boat entirely at the mercy of these corporations, I think, than those of you in Ireland are.
Yeah, no, it's a different landscape in that respect, very different, and there's not a reticence, and it's certainly the EU has its problems, particularly at the moment of vaccine rollout and so on, but it can actually take powerful stands in relation to its expectations of privacy and other issues and access to those platforms. But I guess deplatform has got to be a new word for us. A new excommunication used to be in more religious vein, but yes, we have our own forms of deplatforming. I think is good. Monica, could I ask you about this? And we certainly saw it in the impeachment trial. This, what I guess you could call the politics of equivalence. We have on the one hand the storming of the Capitol. On the other hand, there were some riots that took place in the case of protesters defending social justice and Black Lives Matter in particular. Just wondering what your thoughts are on this the way that one is meant to cancel out the other, or to create an even balance sheet in some sense politically.
I mean, it's a to use another term that came up, it's a false flag. I mean, I just feel like the equivalent, right? I mean, they may have looked equivalent, right? But the reasons why these things looked equivalent to certain eyes, right? But the reason why there's no kind of equity there is that, I mean, Black Lives Matter protests or Black Lives Matter protesters, right, are protesting not from the place of power, right? I mean, whereas, some of these other protesters, we talk about them as a kind of minoritized group within kind of the Republican far right, right? But what they do have, right? I mean, and now I'm sort of in cultural studies speak. What they do have is the power of whiteness, right? I mean, backing them up, right? So therefore, there's no equivalent there, and that has always, in terms of there are many Trumpian rhetorical devices, right, that have been maddening, right, over the past years. I mean, that's one of them. That is always, a kind of, and always a false flag. I mean, there's nothing there.
No, it's been, Trump is extraordinarily effective. Is almost a preternatural ability to turn things around. And Dan, you were commenting on his surviving the first impeachment. If anything, he was strengthened by it, or Stephanie as well. It's like, yeah, Trump came out better as a result of that. This is what a weird.
Yeah. I mean, there's a fascinating way in which, I think over the last many years, a lot of people have made fun of Trump's kind of bumbling rhetoric, right? Yeah, but we also need to recognize like the ways in which, some of those rhetorical formulations that he's come up with have been incredibly effective, right? I mean, in particular, related to what we were just talking about, in particular related to the Twitter format, right? I mean, they work really well, right, in 140 characters. So, I mean, and so there's ways in which, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of work to be done to sort of understand, right? Even down to the kind of like linguistic nature of the political rhetoric, how well it's functioned, right? And how, when I was watching the impeachment trial, I mean, just being we've all talked about this, refreshed and amazed, right? That people have a command of the English language that's subtle and nuanced. I mean, except for, I completely agree with Stephanie towards the end, right? When when there are all these appeals to, American ideals that we've seen fail again and again. But nevertheless, just like straightforward argumentation, critical, analytical speech that was right on point and kind of beautiful to witness, right? So I mean, there's a lot of work we need to think about in terms of the rhetoric of democracy and what it is we're talking about and how we are talking about it. I think there's Stephanie's talking about new ground, right, and a new place we're in, and I think we need to think about that place not only just in terms of where we're sitting politically, but how we can express that politically. I mean, I think we're looking for new languages, and I don't know. I mean, I'm looking for new languages because the language that we're using right now it's not being effective enough.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way of putting it. We're sort of moving along in terms of time, so I have a quick question for Dan, and then we might come to our respondents. Dan, I just want to ask you about whether you think, and this may be a question others want to look at, is Trump a repeatable phenomenon? Or is this just, a unique sort of political personality who's worked at a certain moment in time? Now, he might try to repeat himself in 4 years' time, but so it's a slightly different question. But do you think Trump is repeatable in that sense? Can others
Dan, not entirely, because I think he has, as Monica and Stephanie indicated, he has certain unique talents, and his ability to understand and command modern media is something that most other politicians don't have, and they might try to emulate it to some extent. But his approach to things, which was grounded in working against and with the tabloids when he was coming up in New York and through reality television with The Apprentice, gave him an understanding of how you can communicate and the power of celebrity and the power of show business and entertainment in our politics. And I don't know that others have that same capability fused with the kind of the pure kind of, if you will, incoherent populism of his approach to, well, I'm making this sound too smart, his approach to governing, which I don't think he ever had any appreciation for. But anyway, it's a long way of saying I think he is a unique figure, but I think he has tapped into something that others will continue to try to tap into. And I know in reporting a number of stories over the past year, talking to people in Europe about Trump and the state of the United States, there was always a hesitation, and people say to me, okay, if Trump loses in 2020, we will not be convinced that this is over until the Democrats or a non-Trump figure wins again in 2024. In other words, we've got a 4-year period in which we are going to see whether Trumpism, absent Trump, has the ability to continue to prosper and draw an audience.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very helpful way of putting it. I think that is the key question. Eileen, maybe I could come to you for see your sort of thoughts, whether there's anything particularly you want to pick up on, or other things that we didn't discuss that you think we should be factoring in and thinking about democracy in America.
Great, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I want to pick up on a point that, well, everybody has sort of said, but Monica more forcefully for me, which was about basically the political power of rhetorical tropes. And in this case, I want to think about the trope of virus, right? So just yesterday, there were articles both in the New York Times and the Washington Post that underscored the connection between pandemics and political extremism, and not just in a figurative sense, right? So both pointed out that throughout history, outbreaks of disease have spread fear, have eroded trust in government, have accelerated extremist movements and exacerbated paranoid thinking. One cited the late Roman Republic, when a precursor to smallpox apparently was epidemic, and another sort of medieval times with the bubonic plague. So in the midst of our own pandemic, right, this is certainly true. Most of us would agree, I think, that a certain percentage of the US population is suffering from an outbreak of conspiracy thinking, right? Some 20% of Americans and Britons, and some similar percentage of Europeans, claim to believe in at least some of the tenets of QAnon, for example. And then there are their fellow travelers, right? There's the anti-vaxxers and the anti-maskers, and those who believe that COVID isn't real, but a government plot to turn us all into sheeple and take away our guns and so on. So I think it's important to recognize that when we speak of disinformation and conspiracy theories going viral, we mean it in more than a metaphorical sense, right? Social media increases, as we've said today, right? Basically increases the viral spread or the viral load of QAnon and political extremism, particularly authoritarian extremism. And although I think that we're hopeful, as we are with COVID, that we're beginning slowly to recover from the worst stages of this sort of anti-democratic, white supremacist, right-wing extremism that we've had in the Trump regime, I think it would be a big mistake to think that we'll ever fully recover. There will always be a proportion of the population, of any population, that's susceptible to conspiracy theories and attracted to strong men, that exhibits symptoms of xenophobia and white supremacy, that is essentially anti-democratic. And so I think we'd be better off in thinking in terms not of cure or making a full recovery from Trumpism or even COVID, but rather to think about the body politic as we would think about those with addictions, right? That we're always in the process of being in recovery. So the best thing we can do, I think, to protect ourselves is to stay vigilant, to stay on the wagon, so to speak, right? To remember that the body politic is always vulnerable, because if we don't, we'll be in even a deadlier situation, I think, with the next authoritarian leader. I mean, often people have pointed out that what saved Trump from another election cycle and the death of democracy had to do with this bumbling nature. People like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, they're not so bumbling. So that I think that we might say that in the sense we're long haulers, right? That we have to sort of deal with this stuff from here on out, or as Stephanie, I think, said, we're in it for the long, dirty haul.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's extremely interesting. I haven't heard it put that way, but I think that's quite compelling. I've been struck by the language that has often come out in relation to the attack on the Capitol. This is not who we are. And the same thing was used with Abu Ghraib. This is not who we are. And one can sort of slightly honor the impulse, but also to be dismayed by, it's evidently who you are because it happened. So that, I think your model is a little bit more, how do we manage this? Lee, could I come to you? And again, there may be particular things you wanted to pick up on. I know that I would like to get your thoughts also on rural America, which we haven't talked about, interestingly enough. And I know it's something that you've thought about. And so if you give us your benefit of your thoughts.
Yep, thanks. Just to quickly follow up on Eileen's point, I've been watching the New York Times coronavirus tracker. Sorry, Dan, Balz. But what's so striking to me is, and it goes with your point, Eileen, is that the current peak is January 8th, the day after the delayed certification of the election. So we have, it seems to me, the epidemiological record of a political crisis right there, at least now. And it also means, of course, that we're going to have, as you're pointing out, the virus will remain with us, even if it's diminished. And the question is whether somebody can reconstitute it, so to speak, or give it a new variant. So, yeah, I was going to talk a little about the move from Manhattan to Clemson. And one thing that I keep thinking of that happened early in my time here when I was teaching, as I do, John Milton, who advocates the execution of King Charles I. I said something offhanded in the way that I had grown up in Boston and New York doing about the US being a democracy. And one of my students, and 65% of the students are from the state of South Carolina, said, we don't have a democracy. America is a republic. And this goes, it seems to me, to the rhetoric of democracy that Monica was talking about. It goes to the fact that we're stuck with two-party environment, as Dan Balz was putting it. And if you have this binary, and then one party is the Democrat Party. Remember how right now they mispronounce this instead of the Democratic Party. Then by definition, the other one is the non-Democrat Party. And we actually, so we saw the political project of the Republican Party enacted on January 6th. If you understand America to be a tension between a democracy and a republic, and if you construct republic as being the opposite of democracy, instead of two variations of democracy or two variations of republic. But the way it was received here in this rural setting, a town of 11,000, whose nearest neighbor is a town of 3,000 in the Blue Ridge Mountains, when I got here was, we don't have a democracy, we have a republic, and these are different. I had to add a unit then about what republicanism meant in Milton's time, and which is to say, in part, what it meant when the framers were working a century later. I think, so it's also related then to the fact that we are governed now by a minority. That's what it means to say, I think, for that student, that it's not a democracy, it's a republic. It's meant to be run by a minority. That would be the South Carolina, historic South Carolina position. And what we face then demographically is this emergence of a 15-state region spread across the country where 70% of the population will live by 2040. Set aside what other demographic distinctions there might be about them, the majority of the country is going to be in 15 states. They'll have 30 senators. So the remaining 30% of the population will have 70 senators. And we're watching that Senate contest emerge. And we're living with the anti-democratic results of it. And we have a party that may be popularly understood by its members to be the one that is opposed to democracy. This is like a social history version of Heather Cox Richardson's point about the Republican Party making a deal in the 1870s from which they never went back, about committing themselves to power first over democracy. The other thing that I wanted to mention from the title of the panel on, I went to the bookshelves and I got the namesake of the title, Democracy in America. And I hadn't taught, I work in an earlier period and I hadn't taught this in years, decades probably. But I was struck just by things de Tocqueville said and how they resonate with our experience and things that have been said here today. De Tocqueville says, if the Americans did abandon the Republic, they would move quickly to despotism without tarrying for long in monarchy. And I do think with the family, I wonder if that was our tarry, whether we had our aristocratic nobility there as we were moving, or maybe still moving from republic to despotism. Now, before you get too concerned, de Tocqueville's very positive about American despotism. It would be extensive and it would degrade men without tormenting them. So it would be a mild form of despotism. So de Tocqueville also says, and this goes to the point about the media, that Americans who are almost always sober frequently allow themselves to be propelled well beyond the limits of reason by a sudden passion or ill-considered opinion. And at times they will in all seriousness behave in the most strikingly thoughtless ways. And then finally, on the combination of anti-democratic democracy and the question which Fintan O'Toole talks about in the New York Review of Books about whether the crowd called Trump or Trump called the crowd on January 6th. De Tocqueville, in the second part of, so after 5 years reflection, part of Democracy in America, says that Americans feel the need to be led and the desire to remain free. Unable to destroy either of these instincts, they seek to satisfy both at once. They imagine a single omnipotent tutelary power, but one elected by the citizens. They combine centralization with popular sovereignty. This gives them some respite. They console themselves for being treated as wards by imagining they have chosen their own protectors. 1835, and then this was 1840, or it was January 6th, which is also December 19th, which is also 2016. Thanks.
That's fantastic. I don't think there's a better way to end than coming back to an inspiring figure of de Tocqueville. And I know people have obligations and of all sorts to continue with in the day. Thank you so much for a wonderful session and so thought-provoking. I feel like I have a deeper understanding. I have causes for worry and some causes for thinking about ways that we might move forward, admittedly with caution. And accepting the kind of predicament that we're in, that it's also a long road ahead. So thank you very much to everybody for participating and for joining us today. So take care.